Hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the aquatic ecosystem. So looking at this figure right here, seeing the different parts that are involved in it, the hydrologic cycle, freshwater systems, groundwater, runoff, pollution, all these different things. We're going to kind of touch on all of those today as they're all part of water on this planet in the aquatic ecosystem. So when we talk about the hydrologic cycle, we're saying the cycling of water, the idea that water circulates between liquid, gas, and solid stages. So when we say water, and we're talking about water, we're talking about water in the air, so humidity, clouds, fog. We're talking about water on the surface of the land, so streams, lakes, puddles, surface soil water, rivers, all that. And then also beneath the surface, groundwater in our aquifers, and the water circulating between these places, and also evaporating and condensating and getting to and from these places. That's all part of the water or hydrologic cycle. So the sun is the main driver of the water cycle. So the sun will heat up the water. The water will then evaporate and lift and cause condensation, and that's through that process we can get precipitation. So we get the water to lose some water, but then also we can get water back into the system. That water will then hit into a watershed where it works its way all the way down and then works its way into the soil, and kind of the process keeps going. And water works from uphill to downhill because gravity is important in terms of the way water flows, and this cycle keeps perpetuating. As long as the sun keeps shining and hitting the water, this cycle is going to be continually perpetuated. So here's looking at the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle again, but just maybe kind of giving it a different look by throwing in there the idea of uphill to downhill, and understanding when we've, I can't remember if we've mentioned it before, but the continental divide. So in the United States, the continental divide is the Rocky Mountains. And so what happens and why is that important is that it's the continental divide, and what that means is that all the water east of the Rocky Mountains is going to flow down to the Gulf of Mexico or out to the Atlantic or the Great Lakes. All the water west of the Rocky Mountains is going to flow out to the Pacific Ocean or the Gulf in Baja California. And so it's really important to understand that that's kind of the basics of how topography and the hydrologic cycle work. And so trying to kind of put that in a picture form is what we're looking at here. So you're going to get some precipitation or even ice and snow that will eventually work its way into the ground or into a lake or into a river system. But that water is always flowing eventually out towards the ocean. And that's where having an understanding of elevation makes sense, because if the ocean is kind of our, and sea level is our zero elevation, we know that everything is going to be, or for the most part, everything is going to be up above there and flow out towards the ocean. In terms of water on this planet, it's a really important idea to understand that only 2.5% of the water on this planet is the water that we actually use. Now, what's crazy to think about is that 97% of the water is ocean water, and only 2.5% is the fresh water that we use. But that's actually enough water for everybody on this planet. It's plenty of water, but it's plenty of water if we don't, if the population doesn't grow to a certain size, and if that water stays available. So what I mean by that is that of that 2.5%, almost 69% of it's in glaciers and ice caps. So people always say, you know, like, why should I care about climate change, or how should I know anything about climate change, or how does climate change affect me? I think the easiest way to see it is every time you see one of those big chunks of ice slough off at the polar ice caps, or a glacier melt away, you've got to remember that's 69% of the available fresh water in this world, and it's just becoming salt water. And salt water doesn't work for us. It's too expensive to convert salt water to fresh water, and it can't be done on a mass basis. So every time you watch a chunk of ice disappear off into the ocean, it's gone. And so that's the majority of our fresh water. We also have 30% of that is groundwater, and our groundwater is beginning to become a real issue in certain areas like the Central Valley of California. With the heavy agriculture that we have, we're having problems with our groundwater, where we're having selenium issues, where we can't even use the groundwater, and the groundwater is toxic to us. And then what's left over is about 1% of surface water, and that surface water, even that, 70% of that 1% of water, remember, that's 1% of 2.5%. Even that is still ice and snow. And then there's about 20% of that 1% in lakes, and then rivers, swamps, soil, moisture, that sort of a thing. So it's really important to know that water is the one thing that we need, yet water is something that's extremely limited on this planet. There is enough for us, but there's enough if we understand the importance of it and really make sure to pay attention to it, and really make it to something that that we want, and we want to make sure that we have constantly. So the first understanding, if we started with the hydrologic cycle, the next place we need to go is to understand the idea of a watershed. There is a link here to a NOAA article that kind of explains a little bit more in depth about a watershed, so you can click along that if you're following along on the lecture slides. But the big thing that this graphic really helps put into place is that there's going to be the idea of a watershed is that it's an area of land where all of the water channels and funnels to one single point. In this case, it's the lake right there. But eventually this watershed, as you can see by the arrow on the top, is going to connect to another watershed, and that watershed will then eventually connect, and it might be part of a larger watershed, or it's a bunch of small watersheds that then connect. But eventually all that water is still trying to work its way out to the ocean. The only thing that stops that from happening are things like dams or artificial structures that we put in place to stop the water. So here's kind of a different look at it, but a watershed is a geographic unit of land that delivers a quantity of water downstream in a drainage pattern to a single point, or an area of land where all the water channels or funnels to one single point. What is it channeling? Rainfall, snowmelt. Where is it channeling it to? Creeks, streams, rivers, maybe reservoirs, bays, lakes, but eventually all watersheds flow to the ocean. This can include a variety of vegetation in these watersheds. This can include static water. This can include flowing water. It includes the groundwater that's happening in there as well. And it's the idea that how topography plays a part in this is that there's going to be different watersheds wherever you are, because it's wherever the water is all going to flow to one single point. So usually the idea is there's a bunch of different watersheds within a bigger watershed, within a bigger watershed, and eventually how big can watersheds get? Well, we said the continental divide, all the water goes either west to the Pacific Ocean or east to the Atlantic Ocean. And so really it's that idea is that's the bigger watershed, and then all these little watersheds help make up that bigger watershed. So I really like this graphic. I find it to be helpful, but it's the idea of how does that hydrologic cycle play into this idea of of a watershed and the importance of forests as well. As we can see, we get the rainfall, so we get our precipitation. It works its way down through this freshwater system. It also infiltrates into the soil, works its way down into the aquifer, and becomes groundwater. But all of that water is still matriculating to one point. And so the largest watershed, just south of basically the idea of the continental divide that we have in the United States, is the Mississippi River watershed, which is 1.2 million square miles. And the Mississippi River starts all the way up in Itasca State Park in Minnesota, where there's a bridge where you could walk over it because it's very small, and then ends up all the way in New Orleans, Louisiana, where it's huge, and it's the confluence of all these rivers and all the little systems and everything in between. But that's also impressive just to think about, but it also can be problematic because you have to think about all the large cities and all the farms and all the people that then are using this watershed. And this is where the idea of a watershed really comes into play, because a watershed, then what happens in one place in the watershed can affect all the other stuff downstream. So it really becomes important to understand that just because you're doing something somewhere, if it's part of a watershed, if it's part of this larger aquatic ecosystem, it can have effects in other places that you may not see that, but others might. And so there's a couple links here to kind of show you about the problem that's happening in the Mississippi River watershed. So what has happened, and what is a big issue, is that there is a dead zone now in the Gulf of Mexico. And what we mean by a dead zone, it's an area of low oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico that's grown, at least in 2017, was almost 9,000 square miles, or about the size of New Jersey. And what happens in this dead zone is that there's hypoxia from eutrophication. And so hypoxia meaning that anything that's trying to use that water, like fish or plants or that sort of stuff, there's no oxygen in the water. There's no dissolved oxygen in the water, so the things can't breathe, so they can't live there. So they either have to move on, or if they're going to just stay there, they're going to die. That's the way it works in the dead zone. So eutrophication, the problem that's happening here is the process of increasing nutrient concentrations, in this case nitrate, phosphorus, and biological productivity in aquatic ecosystems. It can occur naturally or by human activities. Naturally is usually a slow process. This that we see in the Mississippi River watershed is accelerated by human activities. Eutrophication is the leading cause of water quality impairment and deterioration, and the two biggest symptoms are hypoxia, which is oxygen depletion, and extensive algal blooms. And what happens is it reduces aquatic life in these affected water bodies, and then the toxins pose a direct threat to humans and the animals trying to live within the system. And on the bottom here, I attached a link to Lake Isabella, because Lake Isabella this summer had a problem with eutrophication as well. And so how does this dead zone form, and how does this process of eutrophication work? So you've got the freshwater system dumping all of the water down into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, if that water is polluted or has sediment or all these things in it, what happens is that water mixes then in with the salt water. That water gets heated up, and it starts to kind of cut off the area above, because it basically, the light can't get into the water. And when light can't get into the water, then things can't grow, because things can't photosynthesize. And what then happens is that the nitrogen and the phosphorus from fertilizers and sewage and all the other stuff create a huge algal bloom. The algal bloom then starts taking all the oxygen out because it becomes this big living thing and starts taking all the oxygen out of the water. Then the algal bloom starts to die, but as it dies, it's also still taking up more oxygen in the water. And then after that, because there's no oxygen in the water, because there's no light getting through, now you've got a dead zone. And here's another example of that. And then on the right there where it says Florida, that's another link you can click on that shows you some real huge problems they're having with this in Florida, because it doesn't happen just in watersheds in the freshwater systems. It can also just happen in lakes and other areas. Whenever you get this mixing of excessive nutrients from fertilizers or sewage or whatever, and with sunlight. So this becomes a huge problem in spring and summer and even into late fall. But here we see the same example where we get this nutrient load up. Then you get some plants to come up that are pollutants, and like algae and duckweed, that start taking up all the oxygen. The algal blooms happen, the oxygen gets depleted, the decomposition still then keeps taking up more oxygen to where the sunlight can't get in, there's no oxygen available, and then everything starts to die. And the big idea, if you really tried to sum up what's the problem with eutrophication, is that oxygen consumption in these areas far exceeds oxygen production. And whenever consumption exceeds production, you're going to have problems. This is kind of what it looks like, this idea of the clean water mixing with this polluted water. And this is actually a student from last semester, or from fall of 2019, who sent some pictures, who gave me some pictures after learning about this lesson and said, you know, I saw the water down there. I didn't understand why it was this color or why it looked that way. But now I get it. And that's the idea, because water shouldn't be that color, but all that sediment, pollutant, sewage, and whatever is in there and causing issues. So we've talked so far about the hydrologic cycle, and we talked about the watershed concept and then the problems that can come with the watershed concept. So then let's tie in all the parts within the watershed. And the parts within the watershed that become important then are freshwater systems. And how do we move water from one place to another within the watershed? So the two types of freshwater systems that we have are LOTIC and LENTIC. So a flowing water habitat is known as a LOTIC system. A LENTIC system is non-flowing. So on the example on the left, we see kind of a little stream flow. So that's going to be a LOTIC system where water is flowing or moving. A LENTIC system is predominantly non-flowing. The water still moves around, but the water doesn't really go anywhere. So like a lake or a pond, that's what we think of as a lentic system. So our LOTIC system morphology, or our parts to a LOTIC system, the water is going to start at the headwaters, so usually uphill somewhere. Like when we were discussing the Mississippi River watershed, I said Itasca State Park in Minnesota, that's where the headwaters were, but then it dumped all the way down at the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so the mouth for the Mississippi River watershed is the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans, Louisiana. The headwaters up there is all the way in Minnesota. You'll have the headwaters, so that's where we get the precipitation or the snow or whatever input we have in terms of water into the system. That water then, through gravity and topography, will work its way downhill. The main body of water, so the main river or stream or creek, that's called the river channel. And then connecting to that main river channel is going to be the tributaries. So all the little rivers, smaller rivers, and smaller creeks and streams and all of that off in the lateral directions, those are going to be called tributaries. Your floodplain is going to be the flat, low-lying area that can get covered with water when the river overflows. So one thing that's interesting to think about, because we have the Kern River here as our big example, you can really see the floodplain areas of the Kern River, because you can tell where it's flat and where it looks like if the water was to really flow heavy, the areas where it could flood easily. That's going to be your floodplain. When you get close to the river bank, which is the edge of the river, that's where you're going to get your riparian zones, and we're about to talk about those, and then also your wetlands. So wetlands are going to be your low-lying area where water covers up the soil the majority of the year. So those are all parts of a LOTIC system, all parts of a flowing water system. A lentic system, when we're talking about lentic systems, we're talking about lakes, and we're talking about it being a resting place for surface water flowing out of a watershed towards the ocean. And before we talked about that being 21% of the Earth's fresh water. 21% of that, that small fraction of the fresh water. In lakes, it doesn't seem like it, but water is in constant motion. It's not stagnant. It's there is a persistent current. It's just much less than in rivers. You might hear the word lacustrine being used, and that's just another way for saying lakes, or dealing with the water in lakes is lacustrine. And then with your lakes, your heat is found in the upper layers, and so there's going to be more biological activity in the upper layers, less biological activity down below. We said once you get towards the river banks, you're going to run into riparian zones. So riparian zones are transitional zones between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. And what do? They give a moisture gradient, so there'll be they kind of divvy up the moisture in the soil. They help stabilize the bank. They can reduce erosion. They protect water quality by filtering before your precipitation or runoff gets into the river or stream or creek. These areas are highly diverse, so lots of different plant and animal species. And whenever you get lots and different plant species or lots of different producers, you're going to get lots of different animals. So it becomes a big area in terms of diversity. It also can help reduce flood damage. They help create wildlife habitat. They provide shade for the streams to prevent thermal pollution, and they also are aesthetically pleasing. So riparian zones provide a huge benefit for these aquatic ecosystems. Wetlands are areas where water covers the soil or is present either at or near the surface of the soil all year or for varying periods of time during the year, including the growing season. So that's the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's definition of a wetland. So basically areas where the water is covering the soil and you have vegetation growing. So here on the left, you see a lot of different examples of what would constitute a wetland area. Sometimes there's going to be water there just constantly, like a swamp, but sometimes it's only going to be water there part of the year. So you can see in that middle row on the right hand side, you're looking and you say, well, what? I just see grass mostly. It doesn't have to be wet all times of the year. It can be wet just some times of the year. On the right here, I definitely don't expect you guys to memorize all of these, but I just want you to give you an idea that when we're talking about wetlands, you'll hear a lot of different terms, and they all are wetlands. So a swamp, a marsh, a bog, a fend, a peatland, a mire, a moor, a wet prairie, a wet meadow, a slough, a pothole, a playa, a bottomland. They're all talking about wetlands. Potholes, that's one specific more to like the Minnesota, Dakotas type area, Canada. Playa is a term used in Texas a lot for marsh-like ponds, but there's all these different terms. They all are describing these wetland areas. But wetlands matter a lot, much like riparian zones matter a lot, because going down to this last line already there, acre for acre, wetlands have as much biological diversity as a rainforest. And if you just think about it, these wetland areas, because of the constant sunlight and water being present, they're able to produce a lot of different plants and a lot of different types of plants. And anytime you have a lot of producers, you're then going to get a lot of consumers. And if you have a lot of producers and a lot of consumers, you have very high biological diversity, which means those areas become important, because we said before that if you've got a lot of producers, then you can have a lot of niches. And if you got a lot of niches, you can get a lot of different animals. And so what happens, though, if these areas disappear? Then a lot of different animals would then have to become in competition with each other, and then a bunch of animal species might disappear. So wetlands are extremely valuable in terms of not only just ecosystem services like filtering out pollutants and providing shade and wildlife habitat and things like that, but they're also really just the idea of them being there to provide niches and to provide the world with biological diversity. And there's a lot of wetland areas throughout the United States. So we talked about LENTIC systems, we talked about LOTIC systems, and so the one area that we need to talk about is the estuarine ecosystem, or the area where this freshwater eventually will meet up with the salt water. So an estuary is a partially enclosed body of water along the coast where fresh water from rivers and streams meets and mixes with salt water from the ocean. The mixture of fresh water and salt water is called brackish water. So if you ever hear the term brackish water, they're talking about where fresh water and salt water mix. And there are species that can either tolerate the brackish water or live specifically in that brackish water. Estuaries are usually going to be areas that basically are mixed with wetlands and riparian zones mixed in there as well. They're very highly productive in terms of biological diversity, and extremely important because these areas can get damaged very easily because it's a very fragile ecosystem. So this picture right here, kind of trying to tie it all together. I know the graphic was actually meant for something else, but I really like it in terms of the way it ties together what we've talked about. So we talked about the whole hydrologic cycle, about water moving from land all the way to the ocean, and we talked about the idea of a watershed having this topographical or geographic area that funnels water all to one spot. And within this graphic here, we can see our watershed, we can see some of our LOTIC systems, or we see a couple of the streams coming together and then merging into one big channel to form our LOTIC system. And then we see 3 LENTIC systems as well. We see 3 lakes sitting there. And lakes, like I said, don't always, the water is technically flowing there, because if anybody's gone to a lake, you see it just hitting, it's hitting the shore. The water's just doesn't just sit there. And so sometimes those LENTIC and LOTIC systems can merge together. But you see, eventually it works its way out to the estuary. All along here, you're going to have riparian zones. Anywhere where you transition from land to aquatic ecosystem, you're going to have a riparian zone, and then you can also have wetland areas all along these freshwater systems. And then eventually you get to the estuary, where you get that mixture of fresh water and salt water, and that mixture of fresh water and salt water is called brackish water. And then eventually you get to the ocean. And with the ocean, or marine systems, really the only big thing that I want you to understand with the ocean is that temperature is the primary driver of productivity. So where is the ocean going to be more productive, or where are you going to see more species of life in the ocean? You're going to see it where it's a little bit warmer. So along the equator, we're going to see a lot more species than we're going to see towards the North Pole or the South Pole, just because it goes back to that idea that we talked about in terms of zone of tolerance, zone of physiological stress, zone of intolerance. Certain animals are very happy in a certain area, and for the ocean, that's temperature driven. There's a lot of animals that are happy when the ocean is warm. There's a lot of animals who are not as happy if it gets colder, but they'll deal with it. And there's only a very few that are, large enough or thick enough that they can handle those very cold temperatures. And so this is going to be the first half of this lecture, and in the second half we're going to talk about current issues.